Hello and welcome. My name is Lauren Chapman. I'm the Clinical Director at Woodbury Autism Education and Research. I'm here today to talk to you about ensuring consistency across programme intervention. So our aims for today are to define what treatment integrity is, to discuss how to measure treatment integrity, to discuss the development of staff performance checklists, and to discuss the importance of training and feedback in treatment integrity, and most importantly its impact on student outcomes. So let's start with definitions. So when we talk about procedural integrity, we're talking about the degree to which a treatment or procedure is implemented as described and intended. And treatment fidelity is actually a strategy that is used to monitor and enhance the accuracy and consistency of an intervention to ensure it is implemented as planned and that each component is delivered in a comparable manner over time. So when we talk about this, it's important to reference back to the ethical guidelines for the BACB. As a BACB, we are required to follow these guidelines and to ensure that all the services we provide are available in a form that is understandable to the general public and that we disseminate knowledge of our practices. Obviously, procedural integrity requires us to be able to effectively disseminate our knowledge, explain our procedures and intervention in such a way that they can accurately and consistently be implemented. This is even more of an issue when we're talking about being a BACB in Australia, based on the large population of Australia and the number of BCBAs available. So procedural integrity is more than just something that is important to do. It really is something that we are ethically required to do to ensure that we're providing the best possible practices and the best possible outcomes for our students, clients and children. So when we talk about consistency or success, consistency is really important in terms of the success of the intervention for which we're providing. If you look at this quote in the bottom right, it's not what we do once in a while that shapes our lives, it's what we do consistently. So if we start by taking this back to the principles of ABA, the principles of behaviour, if you think about reinforcement, we know that a behaviour that is reinforced consistently will increase. If you think about punishment, we know that a behaviour that is punished consistently will decrease. However, if you think of the principle of intermittent reinforcement or an intermittent schedule of reinforcement, whereby a behaviour sometimes is met with reinforcement and sometimes is not, this leads to behaviours which are more durable and more difficult to intervene on. This intermittent schedule of reinforcement is essentially what happens when you're inconsistently implementing a programme. And this can have an effect on academic tasks and on behavioural tasks, but ultimately the inconsistent intervention will lead to an intermittent schedule of reinforcement, meaning ultimately you're probably going to be at some point reinforcing the behaviour you don't want to see, and also missing opportunities to reinforce the behaviour you do want to see. So the importance of consistent implementation is really key in terms of success for the children that we're working with. Even the best planned intervention with a beautiful written procedure and all the everything carefully thought out is not going to be effective if it's not implemented in the way it was intended. And obviously the careful planning and implementation is something that we should be taking into consideration because it's what's going to have the impact on the child, and at the end of the day that's why most of us are here. So I'm going to start by talking a bit to you about how we developed a measurement tool in terms of procedural integrity. This journey into procedural integrity started for us probably about 3 or 4 years ago when we got a grant for an AAS research project. Now that's not to say it's the first time as a school that we considered treatment fidelity or procedural integrity, but it was the first time we really took a consistent look at what we're doing and how we're ensuring the consistent implementation of our programming. We'd always looked at our staff's performance and their skill and their knowledge, and we'd always measured this in terms of how well they were implementing the principles and procedures, but we hadn't ever formally measured how well they were implementing the plans or interventions as they were prescribed. So in quality service provision, our aim is for the most service providers of the quality service to increase our ability to have a positive impact on our children. And to do this, we require some kind of initial training, some coaching, some competency and some feedback, also recognising that consistent, effective quality intervention is more than just good training. With all the knowledge in the world and all the good training, doesn't necessarily mean that your staff, your therapists, your support workers are going to be able to effectively implement the procedures you're planning on. So in starting to think about this, we looked at what does make good intervention, what does make consistent quality intervention, and it comes back to the well-written procedures, supportive effective teamwork, And good communication. I can't stress enough how important communication is across the team, across all the people involved in the child or the client's lives, to make sure that everyone is consistently implementing the procedures as they're written. So 3 years ago, when we first got IAS grant research, we made a variety of checklists and procedures which can be adapted to each individual case, allowing us to assess the treatment integrity for individual therapists. We're looking at the ability to measure the accuracy, efficiency and effectiveness of procedures being implemented within the classroom, and in doing this to provide feedback to therapists and ultimately improve the student outcomes. So in starting this process, we did a little bit of background research into a few treatment interventions or procedure integrity measures that are already out there. And we looked into the Learn Unit, which is a concept developed by Greer in 2002. The Learn Unit itself is a student-teacher interaction broken down into discrete, observable components, which can be recorded in the moment and analysed or evaluated at a later date. It's essentially an extension on your basic ABC or SD response consequence, but taking into consideration the EO, the MO, the setting events, and the environmental factors. It allows for a more fluid concept of the basic SD response and includes a two-way interaction between the student and the teacher. And by looking at the Learn Unit, it allows you to break down each individual teaching opportunity. So you're not looking at a lesson as a whole, you're not looking at across a day, you're looking at each individual opportunity presented to that child and how the teacher or the therapist working with them managed the opportunity and promoted it and made it the most successful it could possibly be. Research has indicated that the presence of discrete learning units within a teaching session resulted in an increase in correct responding by students. Essentially, the research showed that when you take into consideration discrete trials or learning opportunities, that by using the Learn Unit in itself, you will increase the opportunity for active responding. By increasing active responding, you should increase the opportunity to learn. By increasing this, you should increase the likelihood that the reinforcing contingency will become in contact with the child. So essentially, by increasing learning opportunities, by being more aware of each individual learning opportunity in the moment, you can increase the chance that the child is going to come in contact with reinforcement for behaviour you're trying to increase. By isolating each response opportunity, the teachers have the potential to manipulate their interactions with students in order to sustain and improve their responding. You want to consider how the teacher responds to the child and vice versa. The highest quality ABA provider or teacher is the person that can adapt their teaching in the moment based on the student responding. It's all very well going in with a clear-cut plan and following through with it, but unless you can read in the moment what's working and what's not working and respond to the child in terms of their behaviour, this is what's going to make an effective teaching session. The Learn Unit itself can be utilised to analyse successful components of a teacher-student interaction and can also be used to identify areas of interaction which were less successful. So this is really important in terms of a feedback tool, in terms of thinking about what worked for the teaching session and what didn't work, and giving some constructive criticism to those you're working with in order to improve the success the next time round. So following on from the Learn Unit, we looked at the Teacher Performance Rate and Accuracy, or the TPRA, which was developed by Ross, Singer, Dudek and Greer in 1994. Essentially, the TPRA is a treatment fidelity tool and it measures procedural integrity. The TPRA itself builds upon the concept of the Learn Unit and actually measures active student responding in relation to teacher instruction. And this measurement can be done in the moment, looking at each individual learning opportunity and measuring the success of that learning opportunity. It allows you to monitor student-teacher interaction by breaking it down into smaller, measurable components. It allows supervisors to provide feedback while recognising the importance of the teacher's ability to learn from and respond to the student in an appropriate manner. Here is a sample of a TPRA. You can see it's a very basic form, but it includes lots of important information which is really useful to feedback to your staff with. So you can see you've got the date, the observer, the therapist you're watching, the student they're working with, and the program that they're actually implementing. And then the second column is your teacher antecedent. So you're ticking to show that an antecedent was presented, an antecedent was provided, and the one that's circled in the second row actually represents as an error in that antecedent. So you can see in the comments the antecedent given was incorrect in this time. They used the word give rather than match. So these comments are actually really important in terms of your feedback, because it allows you to directly feedback to the person working with the child as to what went wrong. You've then got your student behaviour, which will either be a correct response or an incorrect response, and then the teacher consequence, which will either be a reinforcement or a correction. or some kind of punishment, depending on what it is you're looking at. Obviously, the teacher consequence should directly relate to the student behaviour. So for a correct response from the student, you're going to look for an R. For an incorrect response from the student, you're going to look for a C. Again, the circle ones show that there's some kind of error in the teacher's implementation. So you can see for discrete file number 3, the teacher actually reinforced an error, and you can see again discrete file number 6, there was a correct response, but the teacher forgot to reinforce. So now you've got a really simple feedback. All you've watched there is 10 learn units, 10 opportunities to teach this specific skill, and you can give some really clear, concise feedback to your therapist, and this is what I want you to improve next time. And then the same, the bottom one, another example, you can see this one is all completely correct. There were no errors. You can again feedback to your staff member, that was really great, I loved how you did this. This was really good implementation of the program as it was itself. And you can even get from this a percentage. So if you're interested in looking at percentage of accuracy, you can get from this either the whole TPRA was correct or incorrect, which would give you a 50% accuracy, or you can look at the overall percentage. I think here you're looking at about 70% accuracy overall, based on the 3 errors within the learn units. So next we look at the periodic service review. This was a training that we attended back in May of this year, run by Gary Lavinia, who provides a positive approach to staff management and the improvement of consistency and quality of service provision. So Gary Lavinia is from IABA in the States, and they're a big movement in terms of positive behaviour supports. And they're really looking at, within this training, ensuring that quality training, quality feedback to clients, quality teamwork would increase the service in which they're providing. So they talk a lot about the fact that quality improvement system based on the principles of organisational business management, and the concept that poor management practices are cited as the primary reason for lack of quality services. So in putting together the periodic service review, you're essentially putting together a set of goals and objectives and standards which are important to the team and that you can work towards together. It's a really nice approach to management. It's not your standard top-down approach or your dictatorship, but it really encompasses teamwork and performance and working together, and the idea that good management practices are the ability to kind of listen to your team and take feedback from your team and having that nice back and forth relationship between the two. It works on the concept that quality teamwork will increase morale, the increased morale will lead to a more positive work environment, and a positive work environment should ultimately lead to improved client outcome. Obviously, the additional bonus to the PSR is that you can measure treatment integrity and fidelity with consistency implementation across interventions. So the PSR itself is a living document. It's something that should be continually updated through regular reviews. It allows you to compare your desired process and outcomes with your current performance and to set goals and work towards improving them. And it allows you to visually track your progress towards 80% accuracy. It's important to note that when you're setting out your goals in the PSR, they recommend that you set some really high goals. So you're looking at these goals not being something that you can meet within the next 1 to 2 months, but something that's going to take you the next 12, 18, 24 months to achieve, but is going to actually represent a really high kind of gold standard, creme de la creme of service provision. And the reason for setting their goals at 80% is the kind of belief that you should never really get to 100%. You're never going to get to the point where you're doing everything absolutely perfectly, because there is always room for improvement. There's always something as a team, as a service provider, as an individual that you can improve to ensure that you're providing a better quality of service. So this 80% standard shows a really high, good quality standard, but also represents that there's still going to be things you can improve on, working towards that achievement of 100%. So following on from all of our research, we put together the research in the TPRA, into the Learn Unit, into the PSR, and put together our own measurement tool. We used the principles of the research that we'd found to create a variety of different tools for treatment integrity and quality service implementation. And we created a checklist of important elements that we thought were needed for effective teaching. So here is a sample of one of the fidelity checks we created, which is based on the TPRA. This sample here was actually created as part of our initial research project, which we looked into functional communication training and the fidelity of its implementation. You can see here a basic sample. I'm going to talk through this in more detail in the later slides, so I'm not going to go into much detail with it here. So to allow me to talk through the TPRA, I want to give you a sample procedure, because then we can refer back to remembering that the whole purpose of this TPRA is to ensure that we are following, or staff are following, the procedures as they're written. So by giving you this sample, we can then refer back to it as we talk through the process. So this is a sample here of a functional communication training program for a child who engages in escape behaviour. So the child engages in aggression in the form of kicking and biting, and we've done a functional assessment and we know that it functions as escape. So we're going to put in the functional communication training to teach a more appropriate, effective way of gaining escape without engaging in the target behaviour. So in order to teach this, in the very initial stages of teaching the functional communication phrase, we're going to present the undesired item or activity for a brief exposure of 5 to 10 seconds, or offer a non-preferred item. So these items or activities have already been predetermined. This is something we found in our functional assessment. I've given my therapists a list of, these are the 5 activities that typically trigger the behaviour, these are the undesired less preferred activities. Let's use these to teach the process. The students would then respond by using the target phrase, "I don't like it," and if the student is using a device, they'll independently navigate based on the current teaching level. So for some of our students, the device users, we break down the teaching levels, including levels of prompting, so we're errorlessly teaching the expected response. If the student's response is correct, i.e. they use the phrase, "I don't like it," either with or without prompting, they're going to be reinforced by access or by termination of the activity itself. So the teacher will say, "Yeah, great job, and I hear you, you don't like it, let's take a break," or "let's do the activity instead." For the errorless teaching phrase, you're going to follow these same few steps for a 10-minute period. So I'm expecting my staff to go in an intense teaching session, and that they should be repeating the same learning opportunity multiple times in that session so the child gets an opportunity to practice. And if the child is incorrect, so they engage in a target behaviour, or they make a different request, or they don't do anything at all, the therapist should continue with the less preferred activity, wait for a 30-second offset. So if there's any target behaviours, waiting for those to cease for a 30-second offset before resetting the opportunity and prompting the appropriate communication request. This will mean continuing the demand or continuing engagement and following any kind of reactive measures we have in place for behaviour intervention plan. So let's unpack that a little bit further. So you're looking at, this is the sample of the TPRA. The first few columns are your basic, the time of the learn unit, and then if the visuals are available or not. The reason the time of the learn unit is important is because I've previously stated in my procedure that I want them to be providing multiple opportunities within a short 10-minute period. So the time of the learn unit is important because when I'm watching this video, I should be watching a brief 10-minute video and seeing up to 10 opportunities to practice the same skill, and that is going to be included within my procedural integrity because that's how I specify for the teaching practice to be happen. And then visuals being available or not, for the initial phases of errorless teaching there should be some kind of visual support to help the child make the request. The device should be available if the child is a speech device user. So that's just a simple yes or no to say that the required items or elements are there. The next one is slightly more complex, so your instructor setting event. So this is you're going to score as either a plus or a minus. To score a plus in this area, the instructor needs to have effectively manipulated the motivating operations, identified the function, and prompted the use of the functioning equivalent phrase. If there's a minus, you need to look at the fact that the instructor has failed to manipulate motivation operations to teach the phrase. They've either prompted a phrase that's not functionally equivalent, prompted a phrase without observing precursors, or prompted a phrase in a situation that is not functionally equivalent. So this is really important in terms of functional communication training. This was an area we found that was actually really difficult for our staff to understand. So we'll be able to set up the opportunity to set up or contrive the motivation in which teaching that phrase is appropriate. So some examples would be if your motivation is tangible. So if you've got a behaviour that you've already identified as a tangible function, to know that that function is there, that the child is motivated by tangible in the moment, you're looking for the child to reach, grab, persistently request, or engage in precursors immediately following the removal of the preferred item. So to set up the instructor setting event, the therapist is going to remove the preferred item and look for one of those behaviours to know that, right, this is a good time to prompt the communication phrase. Same for escape. So you know that the child is motivated for escape in that moment because they are engaging in attempts to leave, they're turning their back to the instructor, they're engaging in precursors, or they make at least 5 incorrect consecutive errors following the presentation of an undesired task. For motivation, so if a student is motivated and motivated to gain attention, you're looking for precursors such as orienting towards the instructor, turning towards them, making eye contact, and at least 3 times in a 10-minute setting, or immediately following disengagement of an appropriate interaction. And automatic reinforcement. So the engagement or the desire to engage in automatic reinforcement is signified by any time the student does not respond to instructions or attempts at redirection and is engaging in continuous self-stimulatory behaviours. So all of these MOs need to be present and linked to the appropriate functional phrase in order for the therapist to score a plus in this setting here. So the next thing you're going to score on is your instructor antecedent. Again, this is going to be scored as simply as a plus or a minus. It's going to be correct if they use the appropriate level of prompting within 1 to 3 seconds of the precursors that we already talked about. And it's going to be a minus if they use the incorrect level of prompting after target behaviour or after a no response. So again, in terms of your instructor antecedent, so you've got your escape behaviour, you've presented your less preferred activities, you've seen some of your precursors, you've seen the fact that the student is motivated to leave the area, and now you're going to prompt using most of these prompting the student to say, I want a break. But based on that, this is the procedure that we talked about earlier. Then your student behaviour. So your student behaviour is either going to be correct, incorrect, or a no response at all. So a plus is if the student uses the target phrase. And it's important to remember at this point, because it's a teaching phase, because we've already specified that it's errorless teaching. You're not looking at prompting levels, you're not looking at how much prompting the student required. It's just correct if they use the phrase, regardless of how independent they were. It's going to be a minus if the student engages in some kind of target behaviour, or if they make an incorrect response. And it's going to be an NR if they make no response at all. Next, we take into consideration the instructor consequence. So again, this is going to be scored as correct or incorrect. So it's going to be a plus if the teacher correctly reinforces with an appropriate form of reinforcement, so it should link to the function, within 3 to 5 seconds of the student making a correct response on a one-to-one schedule of reinforcement. Or at this point, it's also going to be considered a correct response from the instructor if they follow reactive procedures outlined in the intervention plan to safely de-escalate the behaviour without providing reinforcement. So remember, at this point, the student might have made an incorrect response. He might have scored a minus previously because they engaged in a challenging behaviour, but the instructor can still effectively follow through with that by following the intervention plan and de-escalating the child. Conversely, you're going to score a minus for the instructor if they reinforce with an arbitrary item following a correct response, or if they don't reinforce at all, or if they don't use reactive measures, or they reinforce a challenging behaviour. So you're looking at this phase here, you've set up your opportunity, so back to our sample for the child, the instructor setting event, you've set up the opportunity because you've presented with a less desired item, and you've observed your precursors, which with this child are getting up and trying to leave. You've presented the correct instructor antecedent because you've prompted the phrase, I want a break. The student has then correctly used the phrase, I want a break, and they're going to reinforce with a break. And it's important to remember at this point that the reinforcement should directly link to the function. So if you're teaching an escape maintain behaviour, the reinforcement is escape. If you're teaching a tangible maintain behaviour, the reinforcement is access to tangible. If you're teaching an attention maintain behaviour, the reinforcement is access to attention. If you're teaching an automatic maintain behaviour, the access to reinforcement is the automatic behaviour itself. And in terms of the instructor, they need to be able to match that consequence or that reinforcement to the function in order to be effectively, correctly following the procedures. Now, this second instructor consequence here is only applicable if the student engages in some form of challenging behaviour. So if you set up your situation, you saw the challenge, the precursors, you went into prompt using least and most prompting, but you didn't quite get there in time. The child engaged in the challenging behaviour of regression. So your instructor consequence for the previous column was you de-escalated the behaviour, you followed through the expectation, you waited for your 30-second offset. This instructor consequence 2 is now your opportunity to again prompt the appropriate communication. As you remember the procedure that we talked about at the very beginning, you're expecting your 30-second offset, and then you're going to prompt the correct communication request again. Essentially, you're going to restart the opportunity and score another, or provide another opportunity for the student to learn. So for this one here, you can score an NA if it's not applicable. You can also score A+. So if the instructor uses the appropriate level of prompting to get the correct response after the opposite of target behaviour, or a minus if they don't prompt the correct response after that, or they don't wait for long enough after the opposite of target behaviour. So we did see for some of our staff that they would immediately prompt following the challenging behaviour, or that they wouldn't prompt at all following the challenging behaviour. So making sure the staff members are recognising, they're following through, de-escalating the behaviour, but this is still a learning opportunity. The child is still clearly engaged or motivated to escape. So we present the antecedent, we create the setting event and prompt the appropriate request. So another system we put in place was the PSR. So I just talked previously about our TPRA that we created, and this was looking specifically at the therapist's or the teaching team's ability to implement the procedures as they were written. The example I just read through for you was based on functional communication training, but those same principles could be applied to any kind of teaching strategy, any kind of behaviour intervention, where you're looking at each individual opportunity to present the task and to follow through as the procedure is written. This hearing the talk over the next few slides are some samples of our PSR. So the PSR, remember, is from Gary Lavinia's training, and this looks past the idea of just good therapy, but looking at a teaching team as a whole. So following our training on the PSR that we went to back in May, we sat down as a teaching team and put together a set of measurements or skill areas that we felt were necessary for effective, appropriate teaching. And here is a sample of one. So you can see we've broke each section down into a skill area, looking at what it looks like, how it's measured, who's responsible for it, and when and how it's measured. And it's really important at this point to set out really clear objective measurements so that everyone is clear on this is the goal, this is what we're working towards. So you can see instructional time in the classroom. So we're aiming to maximise teaching time. We want our students to be actively engaged at the desk for 75% of the instructional session. And we're measuring this by doing spot checks, which reveal the teaching sessions are underway by 9 AM, 11 AM and 1:40 PM. I should point out that gives them a 15-minute leeway from each break opportunity to get into the classroom, toileted and sat down. We felt that 15 minutes was an appropriate transition time for that activity. We're also doing spot checks to ensure that reinforcement breaks are no longer than 5 minutes. Obviously, if you're giving excessively long reinforcement breaks, you're not going to be able to maximise your instructional time. And we also completed regular TPRAs, which we just reviewed, and group matrices, which I'll show you examples of in a minute, to ensure there are at least 40 discrete learning opportunities within a 30-minute observation. So we're looking for a really high level of learning opportunities, ensuring that we're truly maximising the time the children spend at the desk. The responsibility for this implementation is the teacher. It's the teacher who should be structuring their classroom to ensure instructional time is maximised, and this is measured by the clinical team using our TPRAs and our group matrices. The second example is your instructional time on the playground. So again, we're looking to maximise teaching time. We're ensuring students are given the opportunity to actively engage during lunch and break times. Now, the way in which we measure this, we're doing spot checks to make sure everyone is outside on time for morning arrival. This is giving them time to set up and get all the activities up, prepared and ready. We're doing spot checks to make sure that the staff are considering assignments and making sure that students are appropriately supervised throughout the play sessions. We're doing playground checks, ensuring 90% and above accuracy for appropriate play and communication. I will talk through what that actually looks like later on. We're doing a spot check to ensure staff are aware of allocation of duties. So if they've been given a specific responsibility or a specific child to support during that duty, they're aware of that and they're following that. We did positive behaviour support TPRAs to ensure that procedures for behaviour management on the playground are implemented with 90% accuracy. Now, I know I said earlier that we were aiming for 80% accuracy, but we actually went with 90% accuracy for all of our interventions because we felt in terms of behaviour management and in terms of teaching strategies, we really needed to have that high level of accuracy in order to be effectively teaching the children. So we're aiming for 90% on this one. We also did a spot check to ensure that relevant procedures for eating programs are implemented and making sure that concerns are communicated effectively to the teaching team. Everyone is responsible for this. In terms of the playground, all of our staff are out there at some point during the day. They're all responsible for ensuring that students are given the opportunity to engage appropriately. And the data is collected through the clinical team using some data sheets that I'll talk about later. Here is another sample of the overview of the PSR. So you can see the overview of programming. So we're focusing on amendments and changes to current targets and drills being communicated with all the relevant parties in a well-organised, accurate and up-to-date document. It's actually surprising how difficult it is to meet this goal. We realise once we set this goal how hard it is to keep on top of our programme summaries and to make sure that they're all accurate and up-to-date. But we've started doing some spot checks to make sure the programme summaries match the drills within the binders, making sure that changes are communicated effectively with amongst everyone involved in the team, making sure that there's ongoing comments and communication notes between the teaching teams so that everyone is aware of what's happening, making sure we're sending home appropriate programs, videos and summary notes to parents, and then making sure we're updating procedures as we move along. Individual programming, so we're looking at sessions being well planned, organised and programs being implemented with 85% accuracy, and we're doing this by taking regular TPRAs similar to the ones I showed you earlier, doing spot checks to make sure the stimuli is organised, spot checks to make sure that new programs are implemented in a timely fashion, spot checks to ensure that target lists and mastered items are up to date within the last week, and making sure that drill sheets match the data sheets and match all the relevant information that's necessary. And then finally, group programming, making sure our lessons are well planned, organised and implemented. So again, we're doing spot checks to make sure the lesson plans are readily available and are utilised by the teaching team. They should clearly outline the targets and the activities that we're going to use to complete them. A group matrix, which I talked to you about earlier, should demonstrate, which will demonstrate there's at least 2 target skills being taught per student per session. Also making sure we're taking into consideration the pairings of students, they're based on their strengths and weaknesses. They don't all work so well together, so making sure these pairings are used to promote success. And looking at aiming for 60% active engagement within the group. And again, I'll talk to you about the group matrix in a little bit there. So here is a sample of our group matrix. So the TPRA that we talked about earlier was looking specifically at the consistency and the treatment fidelity of the implementation. The group TPRA is looking more at the availability of learning opportunities. Because in a group setting, the type of teaching we provide is much more fluid. It's not quite as prescribed. It's not, we're not following your regular discrete trial training where you're doing the same thing 10 times in a row and you're giving the same SD and expecting the same response. It's a much more fluid expectation. And as a result, we found it was much harder to actually use a TPRA in that setting because we weren't necessarily looking for the teacher to give the same instruction every time. We weren't necessarily looking for them to help the students get the same response every time, but we were looking for a much more classroom-style learning opportunity. So instead, we created this group TPRA, which allows us to measure the amount of active engagement for each student within the group and to ensure that we're providing enough opportunities to learn within that group setting. So there are a few different types of data collection going along here. The table in the middle is actually a momentary time sample. So when we're going in to observe for a 30-minute period, we're setting our timers for 1-minute intervals. And when the timer goes off, we're taking a momentary sample for each child in the group and just scoring them across these measures as to what they're doing in that exact moment. And we broke down the engagement into 3 areas: disengaged, inactive engagement and active engagement, with the aim being that we should be seeing way more over on the right hand side in terms of the active engagement and less in the left hand side for disengagement. So disengagement we categorise as either being on a reinforcement or on a break, engaging in disruptive behaviours, engaging in self-stim, or waiting between activities. So if when our time went off the students were doing any one of those 4 things, they would get a tally mark in one of those boxes. In active engagement, we were looking at behaviour strategies, so things such as token economy, reinforcement samples that are obviously really important to the success of the teaching lesson, but don't actually require the student to be actively involved in it. It's just something that the support staff are helping them through. Waiting after a direct instruction, we separated this out from just general waiting because for some of our students we are actually working on the skill of waiting. So if they've explicitly been told wait and they're going to be reinforced afterwards, that is a learning opportunity versus just waiting because nothing's happening is not a learning opportunity. And also looking or listening to a book, story or song. So recognising that during a group session they're not always going to be actively doing something, but they could be passively looking, attending, listening, and that's a really important group skill. And then active engagement, we're looking at either completing an independent task, making a request, responding to a mastered instruction, or responding to a targeted instruction. And at the end of the 30 minutes, we will add up all of our tally marks, and this will give us a percentage of time in disengagement, a percentage of time in inactive engagement, and a percentage of time in active engagement. And we were aiming for 60% in active engagement. We also took, alongside our memory to hand sample, some frequency data. So we took a frequency of the number of learning opportunities. The number of time the teacher presented a discrete SD response consequence opportunity was tallied. We looked at the number of demanding opportunities and looked at the number of skills that have been identified for targets in that session. If you remember earlier, we were looking for at least 2 skills to be targeted within each session for each child. So by looking back at lesson plans and by observing, it should be clear to the observer what the current target skills are and what they're working on for that child. So here is a sample of a checklist we created for our playground. So this links directly back to the target in the PSR for ensuring that we're providing adequate teaching and learning opportunities in the playground. So we separated this out into 2 different targets. We're looking at communication opportunities and play opportunities. So communication is defined as the therapist or teacher manipulating the environment to create an opportunity for a student to request for a desired item or activity. So by doing this, they're presenting the opportunity for the student to engage in FCT responses, to tact, to label items or activities, or to engage in greetings and responding to questions. We're taking this data on a partial interval recording for a 30-second interval across 10 opportunities. So just for out there observing, we've got our timer on. If the communication opportunity occurs in the interval, we'll score it as a plus. If it didn't occur, we'll score it as a minus. We're also looking at the number of staff included and the number of pupils included. We included this measure because we found one of our first partial interval recordings, we had 100%, which is like, oh, that's great, look how many teaching opportunities we're giving these children. But when we actually more closely analysed it, it was 1 staff member playing with 1 child for the duration of the observation. Which, while this is great, it also isn't spreading our resources. It's not taking into consideration all the other students out there, and remembering that the students shouldn't be engaged in one-to-one activities. It should be looking more at group activities, and including a wider variety of students, and making sure that all staff are engaging rather than just one of them. The play opportunities, we're looking at the teacher or therapist approaching the student to ask to play, creating a game or opportunity they might want to join in with, enhancing student time on the play equipment by pushing bikes or playing with the swings, creating opportunities for peers to play or interacting with one another. And again, this is taken on a partial interval recording, also taking into consideration the number of staff and the number of students involved. And then finally at the bottom is just a checklist to make sure that we are, in the observation, allowing each child within the school at least one opportunity to engage in either communication or a play opportunity. So whereas the number of staff and number of pupils in the measures above is just a tally, this one below actually looks at each individual child and making sure they're all getting equal opportunities. So our aim for this was set at 90%, so we're aiming for 90% of the intervals to have at least 1 communication and 1 play opportunity, and we're aiming for all of the students to have at least 1 opportunity within the entire observation. So next I'm going to talk about the importance of training. So the measures I just went through with you previously outline the procedural integrity checklists and the treatment fidelity checklists that we use here at Woodbury, and we use those checklists within our teaching and learning observations. So when we're in the classroom, when we're doing spot checks, when we're checking in on our staff and providing coaching and support, we use those checklists as a means of ensuring treatment fidelity, making sure we're meeting our goals, making sure we're hitting our targets, and also to provide constructive feedback to the teaching team. But obviously for any individual to be able to effectively implement a teaching procedure, they need to have the relevant training behind them to be able to do so. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about the training we provide here at Woodbury. This training is obviously integral to our ability to provide effective, consistent treatment. So we follow the principles of behaviour skills training with the 4 components of instruction, modelling, rehearsal and feedback. So we're describing the skills that we're looking at, and this is our initial theoretical training. So all of our staff go through an initial induction course which involves theoretical training, during which we describe the skill we're looking for, we outline the specific behaviour principles. We also give, within the description, a written instruction, so we're making sure all of our students have written individualised drill sheets, individualised behaviour plans, individualised procedures that give each of our therapists a really clear outline as to what they need to do and how they need to follow it. We then demonstrate. So within our initial teaching and training section, we give each of our therapists a buddy or someone to work with, and that person works through with them and coaches them. They model the behaviour, they model the expectation, they model how each drill is run, they model how all the behaviour principles are applied, and they give the opportunity for the individual to practice. So this here is your practice. All of our therapists are given systematic opportunity to increase the amount of direct instruction they're given with the children while their body gradually kind of fades back out. Also, in terms of post-initial training, all of our drills are discussed and demonstrated in a team meeting prior to implementation. So we're still making sure that's a consistent opportunity to describe, model, and so on. And we also provide coaching and competency assessments on a regular basis to give feedback and set goals and allow more practice. So if you're looking in terms of the initial induction phase, your description is the theoretical training that's provided. Your demonstration is the coaching and the buddy system in the classroom. The practice is your systematic fading of your buddy and systematic increase of your own direct instruction. And the feedback is an initial competency assessment whereby we check off all of the skills that we've worked through in theoretical training. We then set goals based on these skills and we repeat. So you practice. The practice at this point is now support in the classroom for the clinical team and coaching sessions which occur once every 3 weeks. And then feedback is given on these coaching sessions and you continue until the goal is met. For staff who have gone past that initial theoretical training, the description is your written procedure, your drill sheet, which is provided to them. The demonstration is the discussion of how to do it within the class meeting. The practice is the opportunity to implement that lesson or implement that skill within the classroom. And then the feedback is your continued coaching, which we continue for all of our staff throughout their time at Woodbury, whereby we check in on a regular basis, provide feedback, provide support, using our TPRAs, using our data collection sheets to measure integrity and treatment intervention. So when we're looking at our treatment integrity, one of the key areas we were interested in was the outcome for our students. So we wanted to ensure that by improving teacher integrity, that actually had a positive outcome on students. And we were really interested to see at what point or how much of the procedure needs to be implemented accurately for it to have a positive effect, and does there become a point where anything over and above that point doesn't have any additional impact on the children. So we're looking at using a measurement tool to allow us to improve our training procedures. So when we did our initial training, we looked at the levels. Sorry, I should point out this data here is looking at our research project. So we took our initial data on the types of feedback we were giving, and we could see based on the areas of feedback we're giving, there were some areas in our training that actually needed amending. And from that, we made changes to our training. And this is the data that we got following the changes. So you can see from the previous slide to this slide, the previous slide we had around 8 feedback sessions required for identifying function. So we made some additional changes to theoretical training. We looked more in depth at how the therapist would identify function, how they'd implement these procedures. And for group 2, based on these changes, you can see a decrease in the level of feedback they provided. Similarly, in terms of reinforcing correct responses, this was something that was a really high level of feedback in the initial training. I think we had up to 13 specific feedback requirements for this reinforcing correct responses. Again, this was something we amended within our training, and as a result you can see in the second group there's less than, I think it's 1 there, feedback required for that session. And this is really important to note, that obviously the quality of your training, the quality of the instruction that you give prior to treatment was going to have an impact on the person's ability to implement the procedures correctly. And by making a few very simple changes in your training and your initial teaching, you can actually reduce the need for feedback and support at a later date, therefore increasing the treatment fidelity and improving the student outcomes. We also looked at the correlation between knowledge and adherence. The idea that in order to implement a procedure correctly, you need to have a high level of knowledge, but actually having a high level of knowledge doesn't always result in the ability to practically apply it. So we looked here at the correlation between the two, and as you can see in that top right hand quadrant, that in general therapists that had a high level of knowledge in the knowledge test, so a high level of theoretical knowledge above 80%, also had a higher level of adherence in terms of practical implementation. So there is a correlation between good theoretical knowledge, good understanding of the processes, and the ability to practically apply it. But as you can see from some of the outliers, it doesn't always correlate. You can see that some of our staff with the highest knowledge test, the outlier there with I think 98% of the knowledge test, still only has 60% adherence. So there are some other skills over and above the general knowledge of your ability to implement it that need to be considered in terms of the adherence to procedures. We also looked at student progress in terms of average adherence. So this here was for our functional communication training. You can see that across our 15 students, I think they all actually made some progress. They all met criteria at some point. The sessions to criterion range from as little as 20 sessions up to sometimes 200 teaching sessions before criteria is met, but they did still all meet criterion. And you can see that for all but one, I think, of our students, the average adherence across the therapists was above 80%. And that one is the little student number 7 who actually took the longest to meet criteria, had the lowest level of adherence. So it's possible to say that there's some kind of correlation between staff adherence and the student's ability to meet criterion. You can assume that if the staff are implementing the procedures with a higher level of integrity, a higher level of consistency, that students will learn quicker, and therefore there should be a lower level of session to criterion. But we also do take into note here that there are lots of other variables over and above the staff adherence, and that for a lot of our little guys, their learning style is different, their capabilities are different, the level of challenging behaviour is different, the types of communication requests for teaching are different, and all of these will have an impact on their ability to learn the new skill and will affect how quickly they do so. So here is a sample of a specific case study for one of our students, and you can see here the level of their challenging behaviour, which is the blue line, as verbal protesting, is gradually decreasing across time, whereas the level of their functional communication, so the independent use of the functional communication phrase we taught them, increases across time and reaches your 100% accuracy towards the end of the session. You can also see for this one that we're looking at teachers' adherence. So that first, the green triangles, that first data point showed we have a quite low teacher adherence of 50%. We gave some feedback, we improved our training, and from that point forward the teaching adherence or treatment fidelity increased to above 90%, and it was actually at that point forward that the students started to learn the new skill, and we saw progress and a decrease in challenging behaviours. So again, this highlights the importance of treatment integrity, and that the improvement in treatment integrity resulted in an increased learning for the child and an increase, or a continued decrease, in the challenging behaviour we're looking at. So I've gone through lots of different types of consistency treatment fidelity measures over this thing. Hopefully some of those are useful to you, and you can see how they could be adapted or changed in terms of the treatment measures that you use in your setting. The only thing I can highlight is to make a plan. Really think about what areas you need to see improvement in terms of consistent implementation. What matters to you? What matters to your clients? What is the most important in terms of consistency? And that's what you want to start to measure to ensure that you can improve its implementation. You want to think about if you need to amend procedures to support consistent implementation. Do you need to amend your training? Do you need to provide more clearly written plans? Do you need to provide extra support in the classroom or in the teaching setting to make sure that you're actually giving the teaching staff the tools they need to be able to provide the implementation? Can you operationally define what is and is not consistent, accurate implementation? Can you think about what actually meets the criteria of, yes, this person is consistently following the plan as it's met, and what not? And this will help you to measure it and also help you to give feedback on it. So if you can define what consistency looks like, this will allow you to give specific feedback to your staff. And then you want to think about what do you need to do to set up this process. So do you need to create some data sheets? Do you need to set yourself some goals? Do you need to take a baseline data measure to see where you're at now and see what the improvement is? And put all this together to create a plan. So just in summary, what we talked about today is the fact that consistent implementation is almost as important as quality implementation. Also, the quality of your implementation is really key, but unless it is consistently applied, then it's going to have limited impact on the clients you're working with. You also want to take into consideration that quality training, clear written procedures, in-the-moment feedback can all improve consistency with implementation, and the consistent implementation has a positive effect on student outcomes. So below there is my email address. If you have any questions, any queries, if you'd like any copies of the data sheets we've talked about today, please feel free to email me. For those of you who selected the option for the BACB Continuing Education credits, this training does provide you with 1 credit. If you could please send me your invoice showing you've made the correct payment. Also, the certificates show you've listened to the training, and there is a short test that goes with it just to ensure that you've listened in its entirety, and I can then provide you with a certificate for your credits. The next slide here is your references. If you're interested in any of the detailed research we talked about today, they're listed there for you. Thank you for your time, and I hope you found it useful.